Welcome to Living Outside the Matrix. My name is Nigel Howitt, and it's a great pleasure on this show to welcome back a returning guest, Harley Schlanger of the Schiller Institute and LaRouchePack.com. Harley, thank you for taking the time to join me today, and a very warm welcome to the show.
Well, Nigel, it's my pleasure. It's been a while, but it's always good talking with you.
Wonderful stuff. Harley, there is so much going on in the world at the moment that it's difficult to know where to start. But I'm sure that you have, it's always great to touch base with you. You're very well informed. So perhaps I can pick your brain today and we can start to make some of the sense of things going on. Just to set it in some sort of context, of course, the alleged pandemic rolls on, the agenda for passports and vaccines, loss of freedoms. And it seems to be tying in with a sort of a Green New Deal, green agenda as well. We've also got things stirring in the Ukraine and the Crimea. Where would you like to start, I guess, I'll bat the ball to you and what's your view of the whole situation from your position there in Berlin?
We've got to see the crises you identified as a whole package, because you can look at little pieces here and there, but that's a false picture. I think this is driven by the collapse of the financial system. The fact that we're so much debt in the world as a result of the quantitative easing policies, the continued emphasis on speculation. The wealth, the so-called wealth creation is not physical wealth. It's not real goods production. It's not new technologies or scientific advances. It's speculation fueled by central banks. And this system can't survive. That's what the Great Reset is about. They're trying to move into a new system. Now, anytime you have a financial crisis of this magnitude, a war danger is not far behind, partly because not everyone's going to go along with the Great Reset. In particular, Russia and China aren't going to go along with it. India just kicked John Kerry in the rear end the other day. Kerry's the climate czar for Biden. He went to India and told them they've got to go to net zero. And the Indian energy minister said, we're not going to net zero. We have 800 million people who have intermittent electricity. Yeah. We don't have a modern economy here yet. You can't tell people to wait for another 50 years. Absolutely. So the Great Reset is part of the attempt to have central banks not only control credit and monetary policy, but spending policy, take the power away from sovereign governments. And so, if you look at this as the financial crisis, the increase in debt, the fact that we never came out of the 2008 crisis except through quantitative easing and spending. And then you look at who's directing the policy and what they actually intend. And this is where you get to the really nasty stuff. The Davos billionaires, who are they working with? What's the policy? One of the key people in pushing this together is Prince Charles, who's a longtime environmentalist, quote unquote, but his idea of the environment is to reduce the world's population. And he's working hand in hand with people like Bill Gates, the Davos crowd, Mark Carney, the former head of the Bank of England, the Larry Fink of BlackRock, which is the world's largest equity fund manager. And what are they all saying? They're saying we need a new bubble, and the new bubble will be the green financial bubble. And in the meantime, we're going to cut back investment to physical goods production. We'll call it carbon neutral or a net zero carbon policy. What are they talking about? They're talking about cutting back food production. They're talking about no funding for cement and steel and aluminum, the kinds of things that are needed for transportation and modern living. So
can I just interrupt you there, Harley?
Sure,
so
sure.
Just to clarify, the Great Reset then is effectively a recognition of the bankruptcy of the economic system, and you're suggesting that it's an economic it's recognition of the economic reality and the unsustainability of the situation that's driving the Great Reset. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm assuming that's what you said there. How does that tie into the sort of known political agendas, or what percentage of what's driving the Great Reset do you think is also tied in with an underlying sort of political agenda, perhaps towards a global government?
Well, that's the whole point. They want a global bankers dictatorship. That's what it's all about.
Okay.
And so you look at some of the aspects of how they're dealing with the COVID pandemic, with the taking away the small businesses, the so-called lockdowns, things of that sort, taking away freedoms, the censorship of the big tech. I don't know how it is where you are, but in the United States, if you imply that there might have been a vote fraud in the 2020 election, you're kicked off the internet. If you defend President Trump too vociferously, you get kicked off the internet. So you see these things. You see the argument that the 75 million people who voted for Donald Trump, maybe a big portion of them are racists, white nationalists, these or terrorists. These kinds of things fit into it. But what's the goal? The thing you have to start from the top here, Nigel. So if you look at what the goal is, it's the elimination of sovereign nation states. And this is what the fuss was over Brexit. With everything else that was involved in it, the people who voted for Brexit wanted to have an England or a Britain that was controlled for the purpose of the interests of its population, not for an artificial entity called the European Union. Mm-hmm. And if you look at what's happening in France and Germany and Italy, there's reaction against the loss of sovereignty there, but the political class is too weak to stand up and fight. And so you have chaos in Europe. Now you look in the United States, what was the big crime of Donald Trump? He said we're a sovereign nation. Now, putting America first didn't mean ignore the rest of the world, but he was committed to working with countries like Russia and China to find common interests. That wasn't allowed because that would have meant the United States as a sovereign nation working with a sovereign Russia and a sovereign China.
Yeah.
The problem with sovereignty is what happens when a nation responds to its population saying we need more food, we need more production, we need better transportation. And the bankers say you can't afford it. That's the confrontation that we're in. Who controls credit and where does it go? That's the central, when you talk about a political agenda, that's the political agenda. That's what Mark Carney and Bill Gates and Klaus Schwab and Joe Biden all have in common. They think the bankers, the private bankers who control the central banks ought to have the final say. And in a republic like the United States, it should be the people who have a say. So what happens if you say the central bank will make fiscal policy? Why have elections? Why choose a Congress if they're not going to be able to make determinations?
Yeah. So this is a really, really key point in history, really, isn't it? Not to overstate it. We seem to be at something of a fork in the road where collectivism, the global state, run by the central bankers, as you point out there, wanting to dictate policy, tie it all to the green issue and the alleged desire to reduce one's carbon footprint, which of course is based on a bogus assumption that carbon is actually a problem, or carbon dioxide, I should say, versus the intentions of sovereign nations. And so we've got a real battle for freedom on our hands, haven't we?
Well, it's the ultimate battle. And in a sense, sometimes people have criticized the LaRouche movement because of our focus on the central role of the British Empire historically and forces today which reflect that same imperial outlook, whether it's neoliberalism or the neocon warhawk party or whatever. But in a sense, you have an empire. Yeah. Now, the City of London is a powerful part of that controlling influence, along with British intelligence, along with the whole academic structure and think tanks that come out of the City of London, aligned with Wall Street, aligned with Brussels and Frankfurt. And they have a certain view of what they call the rules-based order. Who makes the rules? It's the bankers. And if you don't follow them, for example, Saddam Hussein wasn't going along with them. Gaddafi wasn't going along with them. Well, they were easier to knock out than Putin or Xi Jinping. But that's the ultimate intent, because if you have any nation that challenges the economic policies or the fake science policies of carbon dioxide, for example, that won't go along with the Paris Climate Accord, well, that was one of Trump's crimes. He pulled the United States out of the Paris Accord.
But there are those who say, Harley, that surely China and Russia are part of this scheme in some way, driven or connected to those shareholders of the private banks. What would you say to those people, or what would you say to that view?
Well, it's in the United States, you have the same thing. People say, well, don't think Trump is an independent operator. He's controlled by the same networks. And you can point to anomalies in the policies that would indicate that. But here's what I would say. Just read The Economist, read The Guardian, read the New York Times. Who are they always attacking? Putin. You'd think Putin controls everything in the world. Xi Jinping, Trump. They're targeting nations for regime change because maybe those nations aren't pristine and totally above the corrupt system, but they're not committed to that system. They have a different outlook for the future.
Right.
I mean, look, what's one of Putin's major issues? Increasing the birth rate in Russia. That goes against the Davos mythos, which is that overpopulation is the problem. We have too many people fighting for scarce resources. Well, in the past, Western governments that succeeded funded scientific research and development that created new resources. Now we're told, oh, we can't do that anymore. We're going to overcrowd the planet. We're going to use up all the resources. That's nonsense. And so when you look at the Russian policy, or you look at China, the Belt and Road Initiative, China is accused of creating a debt trap by going into countries and financing development, high-speed rail, energy, things of that sort. Well, the debt trap was the International Monetary Fund policy, which used debt to keep countries from developing. China's doing something different. And that's why the Belt and Road Initiative is under attack. So I think if you look at it from this standpoint, there are some people who want to reduce world's population as the major issue for them. And they're the ones who oppose sovereignty. They're the ones who are fighting these wars, the regime change wars. They're the ones who are destroying the political parties that are based on nationalism. And I'm not talking about hyper-nationalism or racism, but I'm talking about the idea that the purpose of a government is the general welfare of its population. That's its first concern. And most European governments in the United States don't have that as their concern right now. They're concerned with the shareholder class, the wealthy bankers. And Eric Holder, when he was Attorney General under Obama, said there are some banks that are systemic banks that are too big to fail. They can't be allowed to fail. Well, these are the banks that ran the country into the ground, and they should have been put through bankruptcy reorganization. Instead, they penalized 8 million families by shutting them out of their homes after the 2008 crash.
Indeed.
So where's the general welfare? That's the issue.
Indeed. So what about, a bit of playing devil's advocate here, what about another idea that's mooted out there, perhaps you can comment on, respond to, the fact that it could be, because a global political unity, a one world government, statism across the globe is the desired end game for the bankers or their shareholders, shall we say. Is it not something of a propaganda play to be rubbishing Russia? In some respects, America, the USA, is becoming more and more communist, you could say. So they're moving ideologically towards the very entity that they keep bashing, and this would this would strikes many people. It strikes me as being a very handy sort of cover story, if you will, as we move towards this sort of in this political direction. As long as we're seen to be sort of firing at the Chinese and the Russians, you know, it could deflect some suspicion that we're heading in that direction. Do you think there's any credibility to that view?
Well, I think here's where it's credible, that people in the West assume that the Russians and the Chinese have the same desires that they do. That is, the people in power in the West. So if they see the Russians or the Chinese doing something like building a nuclear plant in Africa, they assume there's an ulterior motive. There may not be an ulterior motive other than to uplift the populations of these other countries. But here's where you really see the fraud. The State Department just put out their annual human rights report, where they go after China on the so-called oppression of Uyghurs. Now, this is based on one person's reporting, a guy named Adrian Zenz, who is a right-wing Christian fundamentalist, who's funded heavily by certain groups that are anti-China. Now, there's no evidence that what he's reporting is true. In fact, many Muslim scholars have gone to Xinjiang province because they're concerned about the idea that Muslims are being repressed. And what they're finding is they're repressing Muslim terrorists, because a lot of Uyghur separatists were fighting in Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere. Now, I bring that up because the U.S. is saying that we may not participate in the 2022 Olympics, Winter Olympics in China because of this human rights violation. What about what the United States did to Iraq based on a lie? What about the Clinton policy in the 90s of sanctions, which killed, and it's known, 500,000 Iraqi children? And Madeleine Albright said, well, the price was worth it. Isn't that a human rights violation? What about what they're doing in Syria now? 10 years of a brutal civil war that's largely the fault of Western governments that tried to promote the idea of moderate rebels who, by arming and training them, actually gave arms to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And the Syrian government and the Russians, and with some help from the military under Trump, defeated the insurgency. And now what are they doing? Sanctions that are starving the people of Syria. Are those not human rights violations? So the big fraud here, and the Navalny case, another example, I find it so hypocritical to read the British press hyping up Navalny, the great democratic hero. And if you actually look into his past, you find he's not such a democratic hero. He's a racist. But why don't you look down the street at Belmarsh Prison, where Julian Assange is being held for the crime of telling the truth about war crimes committed by the people who have jailed him?
Yeah.
So these are the hypocritical, just a few examples that show that the human rights claims and the, we're fighting against autocracy. It's crap. It's a lie.
Yeah.
And to accuse President Trump, for example, of autocracy because he wants to talk to Putin when he says, why can't we be friends with Russia? That's a crime. So, I think you're getting at the real point here with your devil's advocate question. These are the ones who are trying to impose an unnatural system, a world government that essentially says we have to neutralize everything, blend everything together. Now, that's not really what they're trying to do. They're not trying to uplift the people of poor nations. They're not trying to eliminate poverty, whether it's in London or in New York City. They're trying to keep their system together. And this is where the fraud comes in. And the real problem is that the amount of money that they've put into controlling politics, whether it's the current Boris Johnson regime with his Global Britain, which is a renewed emphasis on British Empire, or Biden, Build Back Better. What's he going to build back better? A new war with Russia? Because that's what's going on in Ukraine. This is being imposed by the same people who ran the Maidan coup in February 2014. So
before we get into the Ukraine, because that is something I want to hear your views on. What about the Brexit issue? I mean, is Brexit was Brexit fundamentally irrelevant? I mean, if the world, if the the bankers, the shareholders get their desired goal, the idea of Brexit and the United Kingdom being at least on paper independent of Europe, it seems a bit of a moot point, doesn't it? It seems slightly irrelevant, particularly now in the context of this pandemic narrative. It seems that they've sort of sidestepped around the whole issue of Brexit. I mean, my essential essence of my question here is: what was Brexit all irrelevant, given the direction that we're going at the moment and at the pace that we're going? It seems that Brexit was irrelevant. What would you say?
Well, it's not irrelevant in the following sense: the people spoke. They didn't want to be part of the European Union. There was some element of that resistance to the European Union, which was based on the idea of sovereignty. But it's all jumbled up because you have such a mess in the British system overall, the parliamentary system, the role of the city, the role of the Privy Council, the lords and ladies, and the oligarchy. So what happened was people basically said, we don't want it. Now, one thing I've learned from studying British history, as opposed to English history, is that this is a very clever crowd, evil but clever, the ones who run the country. And what they said is, okay, you want Brexit? Well, we'll shape it so it doesn't really work the way you wanted it. And in the meantime, what did they do? The City of London went to Brussels and arranged a separate operation so that they were not covered by the Brexit break, but that the City of London banks could still do the derivative trading for the European Union countries. So they wanted to keep their hand in the till because that's trillions, hundreds of trillions of dollars in trading. And so what's the net effect of Brexit? Well, I think in the long run, it's going to harm the average person because they're not going to do something to rebuild a strong economy in Britain, because they're still going to live off the City of London. So unless you put the City of London into bankruptcy reorganization and jail some of these criminals, then they're going to, like a chameleon, come out and say, okay, we'll go along with this, but let's call it Global Britain. And here's where you see the real fraud in this, Nigel. I'm sure you've thought about this. All of a sudden, Boris Johnson is saying, we're going to help the United States contain China. So we're going to send one of our carrier groups there to join the U.S. in keeping freedom of the seas in the South China Sea and protect Taiwan and so on. And then you find out that there's not even a squadron of fighter planes that could go on the carrier. So they have to go to the U.S. Marine Corps and get a loan for F-35 fighter jets. Where is this great power of Britain? It's financial, it's the control, and it's the integration with Brussels, with Wall Street. And so I think this is where you see the fraud of the whole system. It's falling apart. They don't know what to do, and they're basically saying, as Louis XIV said, après nous le déluge. If we can't control it, we'll blow the whole thing up. And that's the insane mentality of these oligarchs.
Yeah. So is the situation in the Crimea and Ukraine, is that part of the whole destabilization? If you want to, if there's a crisis going on, and you're trying to instill a new system, that famous that age-old tactic, I should say, of just kick off a war somewhere, and it's been done time and time again.
A splendid little war.
Yes. So how do you see the Ukraine situation fitting into the context of what you're saying then? This whole plan and drive for the Great Reset.
Go back to 2014 in the Maidan coup. Who was the person in the United States who was coordinating the policy of the Obama administration in Ukraine? It was Joe Biden. And Biden, in a speech he made shortly after the coup, said, this is the way Europe is going to show Russia that you have no power. And here's something, I just found a speech he gave at the Council on Foreign Relations 2 months after the coup. He said, we're not going to let Russia use its energy resource to blackmail political neighbor or the neighbors in Europe. Now, what do we see today? The Secretary of State Blinken telling Europe, you cannot complete the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Now, what about free market? What about open competition? What about the rules-based order? Well, the rule is we don't want Russia to make money through business ties in Europe. Now, meanwhile, you have in Germany, you have the nuclear exit, which is part of the green policy. You have the exit from coal. Now you take away the Nord Stream 2, all you're going to have is windmills and solar energy. And there's not that much sunshine in Germany. When it gets cold here, we buy coal. So I'm in Berlin. We buy coal-powered energy from Poland because we don't produce enough in Germany. So this is an unsustainable system. Now, what's going on with Crimea? President Zelensky said the other day, we're going to take back Crimea. Well, if you're going to do that, you're going to have to do it through war. And he's now asked the United States to let Ukraine into NATO. That's what 2014 was all about, moving NATO to the borders of Russia, squeezing Russia economically for a regime change, because they liked Russia as it was under Yeltsin, when it was an area where you could go in and loot anything that wasn't nailed down. And they don't like Putin because Putin is a Russian nationalist.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it does look like it's a dangerous situation there, doesn't it? With the borders of NATO, as you say, pushing up to the Russian frontier. How likely? I know you don't have a crystal ball, but given your knowledge of the situation there, how likely do you think that we could see some real trouble starting in short to medium term?
Well, this is one of these places where you have miscalculations that lead to war. Think about World War I. The decision to mobilize the forces, the troops in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire, France, Britain. No one knew in that summer after the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand that there would be a world war that would pretty much destroy all the countries on continental Europe. But it happened by miscalculation. Barbara Tuchman's famous book, The Pursuit of Folly, gives you an understanding of that. Look at World War II. Where did that start? The decision to put Hitler in power in Germany was not just made by Germans. It was made by corporate cartels out of Wall Street and London. And one of the coordinators of that was Montague Norman, the head of the Bank of England, who directed funds to Thyssen and Krupp and other German armaments companies based on the idea that Germany would march east against Russia and Germany and Russia would destroy each other, which was the goal of the British Empire. And Hitler crossed them up by going west first. So could we have a war by miscalculation? Well, every single day there are planes buzzing each other over the Black Sea, over the Baltic, where you have the potential for miscalculation. What happens if a pilot misreads what's happening and shoots down a Russian, or a Russian plane shoots down an American plane? You're within seconds of a possibility of a nuclear war. Now, same thing, there was a war game that was done just recently by the U.S. military of what would happen if the Chinese launched an invasion of Taiwan. And the person who ran the war game said, the question is not that we would lose, it's that we're losing quicker today than we were 6 months ago. So now some of this, of course, is military doublespeak, just like the new British defense doctrine, where they basically say we're weak, therefore we need billions of pounds to upgrade our military. That's how the military-industrial complex works. They create these crises to consolidate more power, get more money, and the population is told, don't protest, we're protecting you from the evil Chinese or the evil Russians.
Yeah.
So this is where you have a danger of miscalculation. And the question is, do you really trust a Boris Johnson or the defense minister there? I can't remember his name right now, or Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary in the United States, who came from Raytheon, one of the military contractors.
Yeah.
Do you trust these guys to keep a level head? Or Joe Biden, do you think he'll stay awake to handle the crisis as it develops? Or do you trust a Kamala Harris who is so out of her depth that if she's actually making decisions, the world is in deep trouble?
Yeah.
So this is where I think people in the West owe a real debt of gratitude to Putin as someone who has maintained his calm in spite of, Biden said he thinks Putin's a killer. And Putin said, well, it takes one to know one. Look what the U.S. is doing.
Well, that's true. But Putin is no angel, is he? He's sort of twisted things around so that he can sort of remain in power virtually indefinitely, I understand. So he's no paragon of virtue. Do we not have to be a little bit wary of Russia? Is it? It all seems to a lot of researchers, possibly not as well informed as you are, Harley, that there's so much smoke and mirrors. It's difficult to tell what's a play, what's a distraction, what's a propaganda move, and what's really driving. And this is why I come back to the point of the one thing we can be sure of is the drive and the political agenda towards essentially a one world government. But wouldn't that collectivist global state, we've got the World Health Organization sort of somehow assumed a position of authority that really it doesn't deserve. It's making decisions and imposing policies on countries irrespective of their national sovereignty, it would seem. So you've got this sort of political movement towards control, and it seems almost inconceivable that there would not be some tentacles that would ultimately be capable of pulling Russia and China into the same unified structure, notwithstanding the squabbles and the differences that we see on the surface. Again, given their ideological common ground to those the shareholders of the central banks. So in essence, if you go high enough up the sort of chain of command to this sort of parasitic class, do you think that there is genuine division between Russians, Chinese, the British Empire? I know, I appreciate to some extent I'm sort of repeating the devil's advocate question of a few moments ago.
Well, that's okay.
But it seems as though it seems inconceivable that there wouldn't be some kind of commonality of ultimate goal, amongst these players.
Well, I see it a little differently. Within Russia and China, you have some networks of hardcore nationalists who are saying they should be preparing for war that's going to happen soon because they don't want to surrender their sovereignty to the bankers. Look what happened in China after 2008. China had a bubble, and what did they do? They arrested the bankers who were the speculators. They seized the assets of the banks that were involved in speculation. They passed new stringent laws against that. Now, when Trump was negotiating with China to try and solve the problem of the U.S. trade deficit, what Trump said is that he doesn't blame China for what they did, because what they actually did was take advantage of what U.S. corporations and banks did, which was to outsource U.S. industry to China to take advantage of cheap labor and cheap raw materials. And when the Chinese said, well, no, we want to start uplifting our population, the West said, no, you can't do that. But the Chinese negotiated fairly in a tough way with Trump. It was a tough negotiation to get phase one. Now, Trump was prepared to go to phase two. The problem was that the Chinese said, under no circumstance would they allow Western banks to come in and seize Chinese assets? They wanted China into the derivatives market. China's sitting there with probably close to $10 billion minimally. I'm sorry, close to $10 trillion in U.S. assets, whether it's treasuries, dollars, things of that sort, property in the United States. And the Chinese were saying,
manufacturing as well.
Yeah. And the Chinese were saying, we're not going to let you take that. We're investing it in China. Now, some people, the ultra-nationalists, are saying, you mess with us, we'll start a war. And many American military people are afraid now that we could not win that war and we'd be forced to go into a nuclear confrontation very quickly. Now, it's similar with Russia. Russia is not as wealthy as China, but Russia has almost no debt. They've got a lot of gold, and they are investing in food production. They're investing in new technologies and the hypersonic weapons. I don't know if you know this, but China and Russia have made great strides in hypersonic weapons. Yesterday, the United States tried for the first time to launch a hypersonic missile from a B-52 bomber, and they couldn't get it out of the plane. It didn't work. So there's a gap there.
Yeah.
Now, how do you deal with something like that? Spend more money? Or how about diplomacy? How about negotiating on what are our common interests? What are our common concerns? And you see, this is the solution, not bluster and threats. And just to go back to Putin for a second, what has Putin done to destabilize the West? Russia didn't interfere in the 2016 election or in the Brexit election. If they had a few bots that were sending out crazy YouTube messages, or the Chinese were doing things on TikTok, do you really think that swung the election? What lost the election for Hillary Clinton was Hillary Clinton. She was a terrible candidate, a threat to the American way of living. And Trump destroyed the Bush machine and then destroyed the Clinton machine. So was that Putin who did that? That's nonsense. Did the Russians poison the Skripals? Well, I think Porton Down should be the place to investigate what actually happened there. Navalny, did they really stick Novichok in his underwear? And if Novichok is so deadly, how come everyone who's supposedly poisoned by it lives? I think there's so many false flags. The Organization for Prevention of Use of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW, reporting that there were many of their investigators who said Syria did not use chemical weapons. So why do we go bomb them? Why was the Financial Times and the Daily Telegraph and the New York Times saying Assad has to pay a price, Russia has to pay a price? So I think much of what we think about Russia is shaped by a mainstream media that's the voice of this military-industrial complex and the financial community. Now, I'm not saying I would want to live in Russia necessarily or in China, but I don't see them as enemies. But they're trying to create an enemy image, minimally to increase the defense budgets, and minimally to increase the desire of people out of fear to say, okay, take away my freedoms as long as you're going to protect me. That's the classical way autocrats actually function.
Yeah.
Give away your liberty and we'll take care of you.
Absolutely. Trade liberty for security.
And get neither.
Yes. Yes, it's interesting that, in some respects, the narrative controls the minds of people so effectively, and yet it fails to predict, and you've got the Trump factor and the, appealing to people's sort of some deep down, I don't want to call it nationalistic, but sort of common sense approach. It can't be predicted, but it seems to me that the pandemic narrative, if we can try and tie this into the picture, it seems that that's really sort of changed the nature of the game, because it set a massive precedent for complete political control. I can only speak for my country here in the United Kingdom. in terms of it set a massive precedent of economic control. I mean, basically complete government control of the economy. When sectors of the economy are shut down and just told not to trade under the guise of an alleged health concern or an alleged concern that a health service is going to be overwhelmed, which seems utterly nonsensical. They've set a precedent for a degree of control that we really haven't seen, and you know, this you can't do this. Our culture's just been shut down. You know, no pubs, clubs, restaurants, parties, gigs, concerts. I mean, anything. And this in the minds of the populace, it seems to be a massive acquiescence to the power of government, which really concerns me. So, how do you see the success, I'm going to call it in inverted, well, sort of the success with respect to the agenda for political unity, globalisation, political globalisation, I hasten to add. The progress towards that goal seems to have been massively promoted, and we seem to have sort of fast forwarded hugely over the last year, where you know, freedom has disappeared at a colossal rate. So how is this tying in, this degree of control, with the rest of the games that are being played in the mainstream media with regards to all of these parties around the world, with, you know, Crimea, with the Russia? It seems to me, and I'm getting to the essence of my point here, it seems to me that the pandemic has allowed governments all around the world, acting in almost perfect lockstep, it would seem, to sort of do what they want effectively. They can do what they want in some spheres. Is it just a matter of time before that sort of spreads out and we see more things changing under, you know, bogus you know, justifications? You know, the whole pandemic, it seems it's none of it stacks up from whatever angle you look at it. So that was a bit of a convoluted question, but can you speak into that, the COVID factor, if you like, and the degree of political control that we've seen it unleash? How does that play into this whole global reset, you know, the Schwab's reset and the political agenda?
Well, I personally don't believe that Bill Gates organized this whole thing for the sake of increased pharmaceutical sales. You know, the idea that you have a small group of evil Illuminati who are willing to possibly unleash a biological holocaust for the sake of making some profit from it. Yeah. On the other hand, you look at what's been stated as the intention of these people for a long time. It's not a coincidence that Bill Gates is one of the people who says the world's overpopulated.
Yeah.
Not a coincidence that Prince Charles believes that, or that Mark Carney believes that there's not enough resources to keep 7 billion people alive.
So if I may just interject, I don't mean to lose your thread, but this depopulation thing, this is a big issue, isn't it? Is that do you think largely behind this pandemic narrative, and, you know, vaccine passports, getting everyone to be vaccinated, all sorts of problems with vaccinations? What would you think?
Well, I think the depopulation is the issue for the people who are pushing this. And they're willing to use whatever else there is with the so-called coronavirus. And I know you and I had a squabble about this last time I was on, because there is something that is going on and is increasing the number of deaths, even though it's not necessarily yet threatening the vast majority of people who are healthy. But look how many people are overweight or have asthma or heart problems, or the preconditions that would enable them, if you do lose a competent public health system, they'll lose their lives. So let's just say that the table was set with the privatization of healthcare in the United States, which under Obamacare was an insurance scam. There's no public health system in the United States. It's a highly expensive private system. If you buy into the government service, the government will subsidize your insurance policy, but you still have to pay $6,000 if you go to the hospital and get sick out of your own pocket. So public health has been destroyed in many ways in the West. We don't have enough doctors. So that you could say this was a crisis waiting to happen. Now, the people who moved in as soon as it happened to take advantage of it had their own agenda. You know, they don't really want to cure the disease. If they did, why didn't they build hospitals in Africa? You know, if washing your hands stops the disease, why don't we do something to make clean water available to the millions of people in Africa who have no clean water, which we could have been doing over the last 30 to 40 years. So, you know, all this talk about how you solve it is a
there are many things. Again, forgive me for interjecting, Harley, but there are many things that cast a big over the whole claim that it's about everyone's health, and you know, it ties in with what you're saying. You know, just trust us and we'll look after you. You know, the trade of freedom for security. The same's going on in health, because there are so many health issues that the World Health Organization and governments around the world are very ready to dismiss. You know,
they ignore. They ignore them. Yeah,
absolutely. They completely discount them, ignore them. And yet all of a sudden they're disproportionately concerned about everyone's health and well-being when it comes to, you know, the alleged pandemic. So I mean, I'm not just trying to justify my concern that the pandemic is bogus, although that is that is my conviction. But it does tie in neatly. It fits in logically with the rest of the picture. It fits in perfectly with a depopulation agenda.
Yeah.
Who knows what's in these
vaccines? It doesn't fit in with the idea that you're going to provide health care for people, because that's not what they intend. They never intended that.
Yeah.
It is a depopulation question, at least for the people who are making the policy. And if you look at the discussion, for example, that Biden, look at the same thing with climate. Everything that's being said about how man is responsible for the heating of the planet. Well, the planet is not heating uniformly. It's up and down. I mean, we're having bitterly cold weather in early April in Berlin right now. I don't know how it is there, but it's really cold here.
Same here in the UK, yep.
Yeah. So, and then at the same time, arguing that it's the combustion engine and human factories that have caused this. Well, how do you explain ice ages and global warming before there were cars and factories? How about on Mars? There's global warming on Mars right now. Is it the two rovers circulating on the planet that are causing it? There's a scientific fraud that was created to justify the destruction of a modern infrastructure, modern science and technology. You know, the argument that we have to stop eating meat, we have to stop heating our homes in the winter. We maybe shouldn't be living in homes at all. All of this stuff is part of a radical agenda which has been introduced going back to the late 60s, the rock, sex, drug counterculture, to convince people that we're about to destroy the planet, so we have to give up every advantage we've created in modern history. Well, is Prince Charles going to give up his 30 castles? Is he going to give up his fleet of cars? I mean, he actually might, because he's a little bit of a wacko. But you think Bill Gates is going to give up his 50,000 square foot house up on Puget Sound? No, these guys are hypocrites.
Yeah.
John Kerry goes around the world telling people to give up everything, flying on a private jet.
Yeah.
So this is a hypocritical public relations stunt. And in that sense, it does fit in exactly with the idea of the Great Reset. And the idea that, well, artificial intelligence, the new technologies mean we're not going to have work for everyone. So we're going to have to put everyone on a basic income. And you'll be dependent on getting your digital deposit from the government. And it may not be much, but at least it'll be something.
Yep.
That's the whole idea, to get people to tolerate the idea that you don't have freedom, that you're not that human beings are not creative, but we're like animals who can be penned up and eventually culled. You know, Prince Philip used to talk about the culling of the human race. This goes back to the eugenics movement. Before there was Hitler, there was Harvard, where you had eugenicists talking about inferior races and people whose lives are not worth living. So we're seeing all of this come together.
Yes.
Now, rather than try and spend all your time looking at each thread, let's look at their vulnerability. What's the vulnerability of the people pushing this? They're bankrupt. There are very few of them. They're proposing something that doesn't benefit very many people. We have to convince, or organize, I should say, to educate people to understand that this is one area where we need government. We need government to regulate corporations and monopolies and financial cartels, to take their power away so that you can have a government which makes credit available to any entrepreneur with an idea, any person with a creative thought who can add to the general welfare, but not protect the billionaires who are trying to suppress that.
Yeah, and not make those loans conditional on it being green and carbon neutral.
Exactly, because that's what the Great Reset is about. Unless you want to have investment in something that's green, the banks are not going to loan money.
Yeah.
And that's the death to the human race.
Yeah.
But most importantly, it's a change in human identity, away from the idea that we are special, that human beings, because we have a soul, because we were created with the capability to uncover the mysteries of the universe and use those discoveries to improve the conditions of man. No, that's not allowed anymore, because that's going to wipe us out in 12 years, according to the great genius Greta Thunberg. So instead, what we've got to do is reassert the primacy of human creativity as a force of nature. Mankind is not separate from nature. We're part of nature. But we have a special role to play that animals can't play.
Yeah.
And the idea that they're useless eaters, which, whether it's Hitler who believes that or Julian Huxley, who said that in 1946.
Yeah.
After the Nazi concentration camps, Huxley said, well, we have to pose this differently now.
Yeah.
And that's what the modern environmentalist movement is.
Yeah.
So my basic point, whether we agree or disagree on some of the specifics, we've got to stop the Great Reset and the Green New Deal and restore this principle of sovereignty in the people. If you're going to have governments, which I think we need, they have to represent the interests of the people as determined through democratic processes. But they have to be a republic, where ultimately we start with the idea that we're going to work for the good of the whole country.
Yeah.
And then we can negotiate with other countries.
So, not wishing to put a last impossible question on you, Harley, but I get that we need to stop this Green New Deal and Great Reset. How does the average listener to this conversation, what can they go away and do you think? What is there some action, some positive thing that you can, what's your view on what the average person might be able to do to affect the desired changes that we're talking about here?
Well, the first thing is to find out who's doing this to us and why. And we just wrote a pamphlet. It's an excellent pamphlet called The Great Leap Backward. LaRouche exposes the Green New Deal. And it's a 40-page pamphlet. It goes through the role of the oligarchy, the role of the banks, what they're trying to do, what the Great Reset is. And then it goes back to this question of what is a human economy? How should it really function? And so becoming aware of these things is the first thing. And as you know, I'm sure, more and more people have been awakened to the idea that what they're told is true is not true. The idea of fake news is now something that most people believe, that most of our media sources are fake. So the question is, how do you know what's true? And you have to develop your own independent capabilities. So that's the first thing. Secondly, virtually any kind of action, whether it's a local action, whether it's forming new political parties, whether it's going in and challenging authority, has to be done. And I think we can take a lesson from the fact that Donald Trump won an election despite huge odds. Could that happen again? Of course it could. That Brexit happened against odds. What happened was we weren't prepared for what happened when we succeeded. And so what happened? The bad guys came in the back door. The swamp took over the USS Trump and drowned him with people like Pompeo and Esper and Mnuchin. The same people ended up running the Trump administration. We can't make that mistake again. And that means people have to become educated, have to engage in citizen activity, and not stop once you choose a different set of leaders.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Well, look, Harley, thank you so much for giving us your perspective today and your time here to help us join the dots and assemble a clearer understanding of what's going on in the world at the moment. Would you like to just remind viewers and listeners where they can keep up with your work?
Sure. Actually, I should have told you before we got on, I'm no longer with LaRouche PAC because that got somewhat hijacked by a certain group of people. But we now have the LaRouche Organisation.com is our website. But if people want to get a link, I do a daily update, a 10-minute video update. If people are interested, I'll give my personal email address so it gets to me and doesn't go through any other mediating source. It's harleysch@gmail.com. That's harleysch@gmail.com. And write to me, tell me you heard my conversation with Nigel, and I'll send you for free a link to my blog page so you can have access to my daily updates, to the articles I write. And that would probably be the best place to start.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for that, Harley. Thank you, everybody, for listening. I do hope you've got some value from this, as indeed I have. So I also like to say, please visit the website, lawfulrebel.com. There's stacks more on there to get you informed and indeed to ham up that point of how we must all sharpen up our intellect and our desire to know and to find out the truth in order to, affect these changes, as Harley's saying. So thank you to all of you for listening, and join us again for another episode of Living Outside the Matrix.
Change you want to see.